Thanks, Orly. And again, thanks everyone for spending some time with us here today. We are going to go through an agenda today that'll take us through 3 basic topics, and we have a presenter for each. And we're going to start off. Can we get our next slide, Orly? Yeah. And the first presenter, Stuart Itkin, joins us from Coal-Fire Federal. For those folks that don't know Coal-Fire Federal, they're a leading FedRAMP third-party assessment organization, CMMC 3.0, CMMC RPO, and as we say, Stuart himself has a really strong background, long-standing background in compliance and executive roles across cybersecurity. So really pleased to have Stuart join us today. He's going to go first, and then after him we'll be joined by Regan, who is the founder of DTC Global, who's a leading cyber threat consultant and advocacy program company. Regan himself was very involved early on in the CMMC. He was a member of the board of the original CMMC AB. So again, thanks, Regan, for joining us and providing your insights today as well. I'll go last. And I'm the VP of Product at Prevail. If you don't know about Prevail, we provide a SaaS solution that is really geared at storing and sharing controlled unclassified information and ITAR data in emails and files. And my background includes a lot of product leadership across cyber and other industries as well. All right, we're gonna start off first of all with Stuart leading us in the CMMC 2.0 update.
Very good. Hey, Greg, thank you very much. And just let me start to say this really is a special day, as Veterans Day, and a day to remember and to think about all of those who have served, everyone who is serving, and to say thank you. So I'd certainly like to extend my thank you to all who serve and all who have served on this very solemn Veterans Day occasion. So jumping into the topic of CMMC 2.0, we've expected the DoD to announce the results of their review of the CMMC program sometime in the month of November. So when the announcement came last week on the 4th of November, not a surprise. And this was really a review that was prompted by concerns about the business impact, concerns about the cost of the CMMC program to small businesses and businesses overall, as well as concerns about the practicality of the rollout schedule that was being followed. And as we expected, CMMC changed as a result of its review. And want to make it clear, it's not dead, it's changed, and it's responded to a number of the issues or the concerns that really prompted this initial review of the program. And so, kind of bad news for everyone. I know, back in college, you used to, look for a day when the weather was bad in the winter and, to see the thing that said, hey, exams have been canceled. Well, where it comes to CMMC with 2.0, exams have not been canceled, but exams have been changed. And I'll kind of get into a little bit of how the framework changes from CMMC 1.02 to CMMC 2.0. DFARS 7012 is still the law of the land. It's been the law of the land really since 2017. And organizations that receive, store, or handle CUI are required under the DFARS 25204 7012 clause to ensure that they comply with NIST 800-171, now CMMC 2.0. That has been required. It still remains required. And the clauses in the interim rule that came out just about a year ago, the 7019 clause that requires reporting results or a basic self-assessment score into the SPRS system, and the 7020 clause that provides the government through the DIBCAC the ability to come in and audit an organization who has submitted a score. Those two clauses don't change. what we expect to see is more aggressive enforcement of the 7012 clause, especially in the interim. The DIBCAC, or the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, has indicated they're adding more people to be able to conduct assessments. Additionally, there was a development just about a month ago where the Department of Justice announced the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. And this creates opportunities to prosecute organizations that knowingly falsify their self-attestations to be charged under the False Claims Act. And there have been others, Rocketdyne being probably the most high-profile organization that was charged under the False Claims Act as a result of a whistleblower case. But I would expect to see kind of some more examples made for organizations to understand that this is being taken seriously. And not just coming from the government, but primes really have a dog in this fight. Primes have been relentlessly focused on risk and risk that they accept within their own supply chains. And so while the government mandate may be at a slower pace or at a little bit lower level of diligence, I would expect to see primes kind of requiring suppliers who want to participate in a program to meet with CMMC 2.0 requirements to their fullest earlier than the government may require. So let's take a look at what has changed. And with the next slide, please, Orly. So the DoD has said that they have streamlined the CMMC process, that they have eliminated levels 2 and level 4. Level 2 was kind of a step in the journey between level 1 and level 3. There were no requirements in any contracts. There were not intended to be requirements in contracts for somebody to be certified at level 2. And in fact, when we had organizations that would come to us and say, can you help us prepare? We want to be level 2. We would generally say, it's really not worth the time. It's not worth the money. What you really need to do is to focus on the ultimate destination, which is level 3. And level 4 was kind of a consolation prize for organizations that couldn't quite get to level 5, which was really an expert level of cybersecurity. So what happens is that level 1 in the old framework, CMMC 1.02, remains level 1 in the new framework, CMMC 2.0. Level 2 goes away. Here's where it gets a little confusing. Level 3 in CMMC 1.02 now becomes level 2. And so organizations that handle CUI will need to satisfy the requirements of CMMC 2.0 at level 2. And finally, level 5 now becomes level 3, with the intent that just a small number of organizations will ever need to be certified at that higher level at level 3. So what else has changed? The model has changed, the number of requirements at each of these levels has changed, and how they will be assessed has changed. So if we can go to the next slide, I can double click on some of these. So first, CMMC requirements, or CMMC 2.0 requirements, more appropriately, mirror the NIST 800-171 and the NIST 800-172 requirements. In CMMC 2.0, the 20 Delta requirements, the additional requirements that took us from 110 to 130, have been eliminated. Primarily from a technical standpoint, those affected things like DNS filtering and backups. And when we did an analysis of kind of how much of CMMC from a requirement standpoint is left, it's about 92% of the original framework, still remains and needs to be handled. Second is the maturity processes, those required at level 3 that you performed, that you documented, and then you managed. Those have been removed from the framework. Those no longer apply in CMMC 2.0. Though I know some people say, oh, great, does this mean we don't need to do policies, that we don't need to do processes? The answer is no, you still need to do those. If you read, and I'll touch on this in a moment, an Appendix E of the NIST 800-171 standard, there's a series of what are called NFO or non-federal organization requirements that are assumed to be in place if not specified. And the first one of those in every family specifies specifically that there is a policy and a procedure for that particular family. CMMC 2.0 at level 2, this is now for those that handle CUI, is aligned with NIST 800-171, its 110 controls. CMMC level 3 will then include some but not all of the NIST 800-172 controls. The way assessments are going to be conducted will also change. A big change is for organizations only handling FCI that need to satisfy level 1 of CMMC 2.0 or 1.02. They will be able to self-assess and to self-attest their compliance. No longer will a third-party assessor need to come in and to go through and validate that they have complied with those 17 requirements. The difference is that the attestation not only needs to be presented on behalf of the entity, but it also needs to be signed by a corporate officer, a president or a CEO of the organization, which again, potentially creates some liability for that individual. If a CEO has signed and said, my organization has satisfied this and has found that they do not, that particular individual can be liable. It certainly puts some scrutiny on that individual. With respect to level 2, used to be level 3. If this gets confusing, I kind of had to write it down and make a little cheat sheet, but at level 2 assessments have been bifurcated. They are for organizations that have prioritized acquisitions or acquisitions that are designated prioritized. And these are defined by the DoD as those that have critical national security information. Tried to look up and say, what is CNSI or critical national security information, and concluded that they kind of made that term up. No reference to it, no definition, but prioritized acquisitions that are designated by the DoD will still require a third-party assessment prior to award. So similar to the CMMC 1.02 model. For non-prioritized acquisitions, again, self-assessment, self-attestation, but the self-attestation will be both at the entity and the corporate officer level. And then level 3, those will be assessed by the government, presumably the DIBCAC. So just to take a little bit deeper look, if we can have the next slide. Very good. So for CMMC level 1, the changes they're fairly simple. Nothing changes with respect to the practices. It's still bound to the 15 information security requirements in 48 CFR section 52204-211, which is basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems. And the NIST or NIST 800-171 maps the FAR 15 requirements into those 17 practices. So for all intents and purposes, with respect to requirements, level 1 is unchanged for those organizations that only handle FCI. Assessments no longer required. The organization seeking certification self-assesses, self-attests, and again, at the entity level and at the individual level, and POAMs or plans of actions and milestones not required. If we look at level 2, and again, level 2 on the next slide, is the level at which an organization that handles CUI now must satisfy. And here the requirements go down from the 130 practices that existed in CMMC 1.02 to the 110 practices that align with NIST 800-171. So the Delta practices have been removed. And again, this puts us in compliance with 32 CFR Part 2002 that defines protecting controlled and classified information, and 800-171 revision 2. C3PAO assessments bifurcated. again, organizations that handle critical national security information, those that are designated as handling critical information, those will continue to be certified by a third-party assessor. Initially, the majority of organizations will likely self-assess and self-attest, and the government has expressed that its intent as the capacity of assessors, the capacity of C3PAOs increases, the number of contracts that will be considered critical will increase till the balance will become more contracts than not will require third-party assessment. So if anything, we might think of this as just kind of how we move from mostly self-attestation to mostly third-party assessment over a period of time that's metered against the capacity. One other difference has to do with POAMs. A lot of concern that individuals expressed about POAMs not being part of CMMC 1.02. Now, POAMs will be allowed, but they will be allowed in limited scope. Not every item can be a POAM item, and the amount of time that POAM can exist is also going to be limited. And POAMs are going to be enforced by contract vehicles. You can have a POAM, but once the award is there, the POAM needs to be resolved. One last item, the CMMC 2.0 standard talks about waivers, and that waivers will be issued, but on a very rare and exception basis for organizations to be able to participate on a particular contract. So kind of what is it that you need to do now if we look at the next slide? So first is, you do need to get CMMC compliant. As I said, it is the law of the land. NIST 800-171 is specified as a requirement in the DFAR 7012 clause. The assessment objectives can be found in publication 171 alpha, which again is the sister publication to the 800-171 standard. I mentioned before, non-federal organizational controls. I think there are 61 of them that are in Appendix E, and these are things that are expected to be routinely satisfied without specification. So when you look at the 110 controls and say, okay, check, 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 I've done all of those things, you also need to look and make sure that you've addressed those things that were assumed to be satisfied because they are basic or foundational to being able to implement the 110 controls. Finally, what you should do now, you should plan to certify. Even if the CUI that you have is not considered CNSI, being certified is a business decision. It's a competitive advantage. We know that primes, we know the government looks at SPRS scores, that we know that primes consider organizations that are certified to be a lower risk than those that aren't, and it represents a competitive advantage. And besides, it's not just the government's sensitive information. Most organizations probably have their own intellectual property to protect, and this is probably not a bad framework to adopt to be able to protect it. Now, second, your prime may require that you certify or meet these requirements earlier than the government. And finally, with respect to the False Claims Act and the pursuit by the Department of Justice, if a CEO knows that he needs to sign something, certainly having a third-party organization certify that your assessment is accurate and correct provides a degree of inoculation for the boss, so to speak. So as we said before, don't wait. And the government has also said they are going to provide incentives to organizations that certify ahead of the rulemaking to really codify the CMMC 2.0 process. So with that, let me hand this over to my colleague, Regan Edens.
Hey there. Thanks, Stuart. Amazing as always. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the timeline and important tasks. Okay, and as you know, I'm very detail oriented when it comes to the standard. So we're going to talk about the specifics because we have a mixed audience. We're going to talk about the specifics to let you know what those specifics are because they're important to you. And secondly, we're going to talk about general takeaways. Okay, so if you're not in a position and all your knowledge, skills, and abilities to understand or relate to the specifics, you really need to relate to the takeaways, and then you need to find reliable resources to understand the specifics. You must be taught how to fish, folks. You cannot be handed fish, because you must be able to meet these requirements and sustain them. Okay. So for a mixed audience, we're going to walk through the timeline, and then we're going to walk into those takeaways. And of course, we can adjust anything we need to adjust in the questions. All right. So let me share my screen real quick. All right. So let me maximize the screen so everyone can see. All right. Now, is what I'm about to tell you, is it the 100% gospel? And as you know, for me, getting it right is exactly what I do and what I try best. So what I'm telling you is to put, when we folks that I trust put the timeline together and to put the pieces of the puzzle together, it's feel free to screenshot this. This is the potential of how this falls out. Okay, so the details will come out. But my job is to tell you what I think and what I can support based on what I know, what we know together. So in the CMMC 2.0, in the potential program milestones and the potential impacts, we start with the fact that we know that the announcement was made for 2.0 and the fact that the current hold for the DFAR 7012 is right now. That in 7019 as a prospective interim rule, 7020 as a prospective interim rule are already underway, and they will continue further, continue to proceed, right? The DFAR 7012, which has been in effect since December 31st of 2017, is still underway. So we understand that programs or the plan of action milestones are prioritized, and that's the list of the things that you need to do that you haven't done yet. And those with current contracts realize that whenever that current contract began, that you were supposed to meet those requirements and be working towards the requirements underneath DFAR 7012 right now, and you should be working your plan of action milestones. Now, there's going to be further guidance released, but based on the information that we know from last 2 nights ago's town hall, we know that those plan of action milestones are going to be limited. We also know that the hardest things to do, which are the most likely to be the most important things for you to do, are not likely to be even included within the timeline allowed for plan of action milestones. So that means that, for example, security monitoring, a major component for what you need to do, what is not likely to even be on the plan of action milestones or be allowed to be on the plan of action milestones. Regardless of whether it is or it isn't, the maximum allowable time is going to be 180 days. Okay, that's very important as we proceed within the timeline. So what we know is that also get based on the guidance provided by the PMO is that, and they're working very hard to get this done. So you can be sure of that. The model team and the PMO are working very hard to identify what that explicit plan guidance is going to be, and then and what the prioritization is going to be, and then working on the revisions that they need to the model document, which need to be updated anyway, and of course the assessment guide. So those are going to be released, and we expect them to be released very shortly here at the end of December or the end of November, if possible, and of course shortly thereafter. All right. So that means that there's some very important things that move forward with that. One is that the volunteer certifications would move forward and proceed once those documents were released. Okay, so we assume that that they're going to be diligent and work to meet those timelines. So by the beginning of December, sometime those volunteer certifications proceed because now the assessors have the ability to understand what they need to do and what the requirements are. Okay. Now, there may be some retooling period there, so we don't know exactly what that is. But again, this is the potential most aggressive timeline because I want you to be prepared for what could be. So underneath the 32 CFR and the 48 CFR, those rules are going to be modified or created, and in the draft language is probably complete. And that 60-day comment period, once that the language is released, means that a clock begins. Because if we take the DoD at what they said during the town hall update, means that once the 60-day period would begin and the interim rules were granted, meaning that they would be effective, then within that POAM guidance would probably also come into effect along with the DoD policy that governs that. That means that at 180 days from the day that the interim rules were released, ostensibly, the POEMs would be closed out. That would be the maximum allowable time, because we would assume that the interim rules would cover the POEM guidance and the limited basis for the POEMs being allowed, and also the DoD policy that reinforced that language. So that would mean that that all POEMs would be completed. So if you're underneath DFAR 7012, which would require you to be CMMC Level 2 certified, that those POEMs would be complete within 6 months of the completion of the interim rule. That's a very big deal, folks. That means that September-ish, August-ish, on the most aggressive timeline, that you would be 100% complete with all of your tasks. That you would have 110 SPRS score. So the gravity of that needs to really set in, because if as a budget, your budget constraints and your time and then attention that you've allowed to this gives you no time to breathe at all. Most organizations will take a minimum of 3 to 6 months on the smaller side in order to implement any of these requirements. Larger organizations take much more time than that. So it's very important that you realize that this timeline could not be far off at all. At the most, I would think it would only flex for a couple months. So you have almost no time at all to get this done. So when we look at the effect of the impact of the interim rule, if granted underneath the 48 CFR and the 32 CFR changes, that would mean that clock would begin running based on the DoD policy guidance that would be solidified in perhaps an update of DODI 8582.01, which I know is underway right now. That is the policy guidance currently for the 7012 clause. So that means that guidance would be updated, it would be issued, and that would reinforce the changes in 32 CFR and 48 CFR that would go into effect if the interim rule was granted. So that would mean, again, to reinforce 60 after the comment period, 60 days, if the interim rule is granted, then that would go into effect on the 61st day, and that would begin the time clock for that 180-day maximum allowable time for POEM items. Okay, so that's an important takeaway. Now we're working to confirm all this, and again, the PMO team is working very hard to get these pieces in sequence. My job is to, as usual, is to rip off the Band-Aid and tell you what these requirements are, not what we want them to be. So this is this would be probably the most aggressive timeline that we would see moving forward. Now, with that, after the August or September time period there, depending upon how much it takes to issue the interim rules, then the enforcement, if we again take the guidance away from the CMMC town hall, the enforcement period would begin for contracting officers. That would mean they would enforce 110% or 100% of all the POEM items completed and 110 SPRS score, and then they could enforce that in any means given to them with underneath the DoD guidelines that Buddy as a program manager for the CMMC program related to when asked about enforcement. Okay, so censure, contract penalties, suspension, whatever it is that the DoD contracting officer chose to do. So that's really, really important for you to understand that. Now, will it shake out that way? This is, again, the probability of these pieces when you fit the comments that were made underneath the town hall, put them together on a timeline, and then you think about, okay, the interim rule, they released the interim language, the 60 days plus 60 days, the interim rule would be in effect, just like it was in November of 2020 and for 7019 and 7020. All right. So those are really big deals. Those are really big deals. And we're going to talk about the impact of that just on the next slide. So now we've got some really important tasks that need to get done. Okay, with that timeline standing, meaning that roughly a September, October, or August, September, October, somewhere right in there, 100% of all POEMs are complete. Okay, then that would mean that folks really need to pay attention to their plan and their budget to get these things done by that window. That would also mean, to reinforce what Stuart has said, that a senior official would affirm, in writing, that they have met these requirements. Now, the DoD, as raised during the town hall, if you think about this, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's just so short. The reality is, and I want to point out, to be fair to the DoD, they have been very, very patient. They've waited almost 5 years since the December 31st, 2017 deadline to get serious about these requirements, either on the self-attestation side or to get the serious on the requirements related to certification as well. So it's very difficult for organizations to say that's not enough time when you really have had time to meet these requirements. What's also important that Stuart highlighted is that the requirements and the standards for about 171 have always been the requirements and standards. Now, people have really fixated on the CMMC assessment guide and the CMMC model because that's been hot to trot for the last couple of years now, and no one knows that better than I as being a part of the founding board and chairing the standards committee. However, though, my personal approach in my practice and my approach in leading on the board during my time was that 171 and 171 alpha have always been the basis for the requirements. So the reality of that is that there is no cry foul that taking away the CMMC model has not changed the practicality of the requirements that have been applied to you underneath the DFAR 7012 this entire last almost 5 years. Okay, so that means that 171 and 171 alpha are the federal requirements and the DoD requirements as they have always been during this discussion. The second piece is that the NIST 853 provides the backing for when we talk about basic and derived requirements. Again, for those folks a little bit more sophisticated, that's the foundation for those requirements in 171 as assessed in 171 alpha. And of course, 5200 provides, as Stuart said, the foundation for the policies and procedures. So you're not getting out of policies and procedures, folks. They are required underneath 5200, which is the absolute standard, federal standard for non-federal organizations. That's you. All right. So that's important that you realize that. Now, when we also focus on Appendix E has very specific tasks that you have to do that the government assumes that you have done and without specification, meaning that they don't have to tell you how to do it, and that are required and organically integrated into the 171 and 171 standards, the 171 alpha standards. So that means that when you look at the non-federal organization requirements and you look at the NTO requirements and the CUR requirements in the back of Appendix C, all of those three are applicable to you as an organization required to meet these the federal and DoD expectations, right? Those are required right now. Last, we're going to talk about in this particular section is that if you don't realize this, you need to move forward with every single practice needs to safeguard COI based on the federal requirements and based on DoD policy. That has truly been the requirement this entire time. But there are many that have really fixated on the CMMC assessment guide. The CMMC assessment guide, the 2.0 version of this, we already know what it's going to say because the requirements have really been before you plainly over the last 5 years. So again, do not wait on the CMMC 2.0 assessment guide. That will leave you even shorter amount of time to meet these requirements. The requirements are already there, folks. They've already been published. They've already been required of you underneath 171 and underneath DFAR 7012 for the last 5 years. So that's very important for you to realize that, okay? Now, an example of this is that people would say, oh, well, the incident response requirements are going to go away because, that was covered underneath the CMMC model and some of the Delta requirements. And the answer is no, they're not going to go away. The reason for that is because Appendix E, and this is an example, lists all of these requirements that they're expected that the federal government expects you to meet without specification that are organically necessary for you to meet 171 and all of the requirements in Chapter 3. So that means that when we look at the NFO and the CUI and the NCO requirements, that you must be able to meet these requirements, okay, right now as a part of your DFAR 7012 and a part of the 171 requirements. Now, I know that there's probably going to be some questions on that, so we'll just go ahead and skip forward. So last part of that is if you're client of DTC Global or in our EPU documentation will be revised, and that will be sent out in mid-December after these assessment guides have been released. If you're not, then you need to really look for reliable sources of information that understand the 171 requirements, understand the NFO requirements in Appendix E, okay? And that you need to understand that you need to seek reliable sources of information. And if they tell you you only have to focus on the CUI or the CMMC assessment guide, then they're probably not a reliable source of information, in my opinion. So the 2.0 integrates policies and procedures. Okay, they are not explicitly required to be assessed like in the 998, 997, and 999 requirements in the CMMC model. But don't think for a second that they are not explicitly required underneath 171 and 171 alpha, because they are according to FIPS 200. All right, so you absolutely must have policies and procedures. They are a standing requirement, folks. Last is that your risk and security assessments are prerequisites to updating your annual update to your system security plan. So if you haven't done that, you need to update your risk and security assessments, because they're two different requirements, and the update of those things feeds your update to your system security plan, which is required underneath the DoD to be updated annually. All right, so you need to focus in on that, and remember, before the SSP is updated. All right, so you need to document that, because that will be part of the expected documentation as evidence, objective evidence by underneath 171 alpha for the CMMC assessor to ask. So none of that's gone away. None of that's gone away. Lastly, your suppliers and subs, folks. Your suppliers and subs are your Achilles heel, probably. You got a short amount of time to get this done underneath the plan of action milestones and underneath the changes. But now you really have to pivot, because the terms and conditions that are likely to flow down to all of these changes to you are required to be flowed down to your subs and suppliers. And that means you are responsible for that underneath the DoD Procurement Toolbox Cybersecurity FAQ, which gives the responsibility of you're the responsible party for everywhere that you flow CUI to. So do not wait. Here's the takeaways. Okay, do not wait for the CMMC 2.0 assessment guide and the model document. We already know what it's going to say. It's going to say exactly what's in 171, 171 alpha, and then those related reference documents related to 853, and of course FIPS 200. These are hard to understand and hard to do. So what got us here is the non-compliance with the D4712, because people had a difficult time figuring out 171. Okay, that's what got us here. So don't think for a second that it's going to be easier to understand and easier to do, because this is not. Okay, remember that the CMMC model represented 92% of the original model that we just replaced. Okay, so now it's 100%, and that doesn't mean it's easier and easier to do. Remember that you need to focus on what are the federal requirements to protect CUI and FCI, of course, and what are the federal requirements. What are the DoD requirements to protect CUI and the DoD policy? Don't think for a second that you can ignore those. They are innately integrated into the 171 and 171 alpha assessment criteria for every practice and every control. Expect for all of those who are like, well, I don't know if I'm a prioritized contract or not. If you make stuff related to warfighting and warfighting capabilities, you can expect to be a prioritized contract. In my expectation, there will be more prioritized contracts than there will be less. Okay, but I don't know that for certain. But if you're in a warfighting capability right now, whether you're a 17-tier stub or you're a prime contractor, you can certainly expect those requirements. There's very little time to get this done. Very little time. Even if the most aggressive timeline that I showed you, okay, if it slips a couple months or 90 days, that's still very little time for most smaller and mid-sized companies to budget their time and get these things done. Lastly, please do not allow your suppliers and your subcontractors to go without your attention, because that is going to fall directly within your responsibilities underneath these requirements. They already were, really, but the reality is that those requirements, because of D4712 and because the expected changes in the 32 CFR and the 48 CFR rules, it will say that you are responsible for your subcontractors and your suppliers, and that will hold underneath the assessment criteria related to CMC certification. So please be very careful about ignoring those, ignoring your suppliers and your subcontractors whom you flow CUI to. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Regan. Thanks, Stuart. Really good information and materials there. I'm going to take back the sharing now and switch to our other deck.
Do I need to release that? Probably do. Stop sharing. Yep.
Here we go. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to wrap up with we're running a little behind our original agenda slot, so I'm going to try to fly through my content and leave us some time for questions if we can. And I know we've got a lot of questions coming in. We had a really solid group of attendants today. And again, thanks for everyone spending time with us on this Veterans Day. Without any more delay, I'm going to talk through some practical advice that we would offer companies from a vendor perspective. You know, I'm representing one of the companies that provides technology to hundreds of companies in the DIB today, and will continue to do so. And I think we have a perspective that's perhaps useful as well, because technology is certainly not the whole solution, but it can help and it can take care of a part of this problem. So let's go forward with that. Okay, so just starting off at a high level, this is going to reinforce things you've already heard from our other distinguished speakers. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think that one of the key takeaways that I would reinforce here is that there are tools existing out there and documentation that could fit your business, you know, the type of business you're in or your size, the type of environment or type of computing environment you have, you know, the mix of commercial and government work you do for a whole bunch of different reasons. You know, you can look at how your company is built and make some selections, right? So the overall goal is going to be protecting the information, whether or not your contract has CUI. We focused a lot on level 2 here today because you know, that's going to require a higher level of compliance. But level 1 companies would have the same type of objective. You know, look at what you need to do and select appropriate technologies and look at tools that are available in your market, because there's a lot of good information out there. And you know, just a quick reminder that if you're invested in commercial cloud solutions, they may not or are not DFARS compliant. You're going to have to combine those investments with other solutions to get to your compliance goals, especially at level 2, where you're going to need to meet you know, things that the commercial clouds don't do. And again, we've all said the same thing. This is not kind of an opportunity to wait. This is an opportunity to keep going and keep improving your cyber programs. All right, so that's quick advice. Now, next slide, we'll talk more about the fact that all is not hopeless here. There are cost-effective options to solve this problem. There are ways to achieve NIST 800-171 compliance while retaining the IT investments you've already made. Now, scoping is the key. We haven't talked a lot about scoping today, but really, if your contracts contain CUI, you really want to understand, where does that CUI go? Where does it live? Who touches it? Who processes it? Where is it stored? If you define the right scope for your program, that's the scope that gets assessed, right? So, you know, that's something to use as part of your criteria. Think about where the information is in your organization. Where you can, use the zero trust principles that have been advocated by the NSA and the recent executive order issued by our current administration. Choose options that fit. So it might be doing it yourself if you have those resources. It might be engaging with cloud services that help, or you know, it might be an in-house project, or it could be outsourced to a managed services provider. There's a lot of different ways to get there. And I would also say, take advantage of the things the vendors have done, because a lot of us are trying to help. Prevail is no exception. We have sample SSP, we have sample customer responsibility matrix document, we have sample policies, all available to our customers that can help get you started. And also make sure, you know, if you're, you know, this is, as Regan said, this is not a slam dunk. This is not an easy exercise. Otherwise, everyone would have it done by now. And so take advantage of expertise. There's free expertise out there. There's a lot of experts out there that can help you. DTC Global, Coalfire, other vendors that have made a huge investment in understanding these requirements and have a long track record of helping companies get there. And that's always going to be a good investment. And lastly, I'm just going to give you a quick case study, because this is a little bit of a proof point that this can be done using a combination of commercial clouds and other technologies. So on my last slide, there it is. We're going to talk about an actual DIBCAC high assessment that was done this past summer, to one of a Prevail customer. They were notified that they were going to get an assessment against 800-171. DIBCAC contacted them. It was going to be a high-level assessment, which means all controls were in scope, and they weren't just going to do a telephone inquiry. This was going to be an on-site full assessment. And this company engaged with a consultant to help them. They're a mid-sized DIB company. There were several hundred employees, not a very small shop, and they did a mix of defense and commercial business. So their environment was Microsoft 365 commercial plus Prevail for handling their CUI, data sharing, and secure messaging. The CUI lifecycle for that type of information. So here's an example where you combined technology with existing investment. A 5-person DIBCAC team came in for over a week. They first did a documentation review and went through all those questions and findings. Then they did interviews against the specific control implementations, and then they did evidence collection on the ones they wanted specific evidence for. And evidence collection, I was told, is actually the lengthiest part of this particular audit. They scored 109 out of 110, which is near perfect. And so the takeaway is that this company in particular is ready to pass CMMC Level 2 today. They're there. They can pick up that one last point and they're ready to go. So that's just a real life example that we hope people can at least put a stake in the ground and say, yes, this can be done. You can be successful without turning your whole infrastructure upside down or rebuilding your systems or any of that stuff. So I went really fast because I want to leave some time for questions. So let's move on to Q&A if we can, and we'll do as many as we can. Our contact information is here. Feel free to reach out to any of us. I'm speaking on behalf of Stuart and Regan, but we are all here to help. And so if you have a question in any of these specific areas, I don't know why there's an AWS logo on Regan's slide. Sorry about that. We will be here to help you with additional questions. Let me pick a few from the presets that came in before the event. I'll try to get to a few that are rolling in through the Q&A window now. I know Stuart and myself have tried to pick a few off along the way, but that's there are a lot more. Well. Yeah, there are a lot more here than we could handle. Right. So, all right, let me throw one out here. Because many of these I think were answered pretty thoroughly, but I'll try to pick one that wasn't. Is there anything specific in the new guidelines that are with respect to small businesses, let's say under 25 employees? What's different for those folks, or if anything? Because there's a lot of companies out there that are small and they may lack the headcount and specific compliance expertise required here. And
the big difference for small companies is it now reverts to self-attestation, self-assessment, self-attestation alone, rather than needing to have a C3PAO come in and perform the assessment. Certainly a cost savings that a small business like that would benefit from. But again, level 1, whether it's level 1 in the new or the old framework, they're identical. 17 controls, basic cyber hygiene, and any organization that hasn't satisfied those 17 controls absolutely should. It really is barely a minimum cybersecurity threshold that a business should achieve. Regan, I'm sure you have some other thoughts.
I do. Would you mind refreshing the question real quick, Stuart? I'm sorry, I was helping Q&A.
Yeah, this was any specific 2.0 things that pertain to small companies, the smallest.
Yeah, so the small companies, folks, when we make a decision in small companies, we're taking $1 from one thing and allocating it to another. And the takeaway from a small company is that you need to make your choices very wisely. You need to choose whom you get guidance from very wisely. What you don't want to do is make an investment in time, labor, attention, technologies, and then have to redo them. Because rework is very expensive, and it change your organization, change your policies and procedures, make all these modifications, and all of a sudden you realize that you're not meeting them. You're not meeting the requirements. So please be just very careful whom you seek out guidance and whom directs you and coaches you and mentors you, because again, you want to do it right the first time. So you need to make sure also that the investments that you have made will get you to compliance, because certification, if required in your organization, is going to be expensive, folks. It is. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So you don't want to find out on D-Day when the auditor shows up that you aren't even close to meeting those requirements. So again, time, attention, consideration, be wise, be smart, don't wait, but just seek out credible sources of information that you can trust to guide you.
Great. Thanks, guys. This is an interesting one because I don't think we spoke to it directly during our content today, but it had more to do with enforcement. So the question is, will non-certified contractors be able to be awarded new contracts? The 1.0 CMMC stated that they would not be eligible, right? So how do we see the new enforcement?
Yeah, so that if we take the DoD at their verbal guidance, which that'll be codified into written documents. So there's all of these things have caveats, right? And all of these things have we have to qualify everything that we see now because it's brand spanking new, and we really don't have much in the written form. But what we do know is this, is that a prioritized contract will have to be CMMC certified, period, in order to be eligible. That also, folks, not just new business, but remember, when these interim rules come down, you're going to see modifications of current contracts in the midnight. That's going to happen. So these interim rules, contracts are going to be modified in the middle of the night. They're going to pop out and say, voila, guess what? You've got to meet these requirements. And then you just got to meet the requirements. And the DoD is going to justify that by saying, well, it's the same requirements that you've been expected to meet for the last 5 years that you said you met. So, go down and get yourself CMMC certified, and we'll see it when you're done. So remember that when the DoD or the federal government asks you to write something down, they're going to remember that. And for the last 4 years, we've been writing down that we are compliant with these requirements. And then they've had the expectation that we're going to have to be 100% conforming for these requirements for the last 2 years. So now on the takeaway is that, well, now at the end of the 6 months, 110 on your SPR score, your POEM items are complete and you're ready to certify, folks. And then lo and behold, there's going to be a contract mod or an update or a modification. And then that's going to say, okay, it's time to get certified. And then they're going to expect you to do that.
And maybe put another way, that even if it's a contract that is considered non-critical, and so that there isn't a requirement to actually have a certification by a C3PAO, the expectation is that at the time of award, your basic assessment score will be 110, that POEM items that existed will have been resolved before contract award, so that when Regan talked about, we really actually have less time than we thought. Under the old regimen of CMMC, it was a matter of, gee, when do I think I will get a contract that has CMMC requirements? I've got a year, 2 years to get ready. Now this is saying that every contract of CUI is involved. You need to be able to have satisfied CMMC 2.0, aka 800-171, and you need to have satisfied it by satisfying all of your POEM items by the time of award on that contract.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's been a number of questions around the whole the change in self-attestation where the executive has to sign off. So what advice can we give people? Like the CEOs are not used to doing that kind of thing unless you're in a public company and you're signing a financial statement under Sarbanes-Oxley, for example. But I don't think we're going to have a lot of that in the DIB. So what would we say is advice for those folks?
I think.
No, go ahead, Stuart. Yep.
I was going to say Sarbanes-Oxley is a great example. When Sarbanes-Oxley came out, I don't know how many years ago it was, and it was a matter of certifying to financial practices, but it required an officer to sign off. And one of the things that the SEC did is that it prosecuted organizations that had falsified that information and created a market for organizations like Ernst & Young at that time that came in and provided kind of that inoculation to be able to provide the assurance for that officer that in fact they had satisfied those requirements. I would expect that we're going to see something very similar with respect to CMMC 2.0. I mean, it's now no longer the liability of the entity, but if I'm the president or CEO of a company and I sign that, I am now personally liable and need to be absolutely certain that my organization had the capability and the fortitude to be able to go through and satisfy all those requirements. And if I have any concern, going through a certification process is certainly a good way to be certain that you've satisfied those requirements and that you've removed that liability.
Yep. I would also say that folks out there need to realize that we've got a lot to learn from ITAR compliance regime, but it is very aggressive and is very punitive. And that is the inevitability of the path of CMMC certification. There's no doubt about that. However, we can do it better though, and we can make it more credibly engaging to the average business, and we can commoditize, if you will, or educate and teach businesses how to do this instead of paying someone $350 an hour to guide you. Right? That's not going to be sustainable. So we need to teach people how to fish. That's been my mission since really day one, serving on the CMMC Accreditation Body Board of Directors and the chairman as the Standards Management Committee and the issue working group, that teaching people how to fish is a path forward. You cannot ignore this. This is not going away. We're never turning back. But most importantly, it is that the devil is in the details. You cannot sort of big moving pictures and hand waving understand these requirements. The devil's in the details. So whether you have the capacity and the ability to do that in-house, or that you're going to be able to trust and outsource guidance or satisfaction of these requirements, it's very important, again, that you choose credible sources of information that are going to take you where you need to go, not where they think you need to go. Okay.
Excellent. All right. Well, I know we're at the end of our time. I'm going to try to squeeze one more question in. If we can try to handle it quickly, that would be great. I would like to hear more about, I think a lot of questions have come in around the POAM items are going to be allowed versus disallowed. And I know there isn't specificity around that yet, but what can we guess? Or what do we think are going to be the items that are not allowed in POAMs?
I think that the takeaway for organizations is that the things that you would put on the POAM items, which are hard, the things that are hard to do, are the things that the DoD prioritizes the highest. And again, the oral guidance given during the town hall is that those highest priority things will not even be allowed to be on the POAM. So it's very important in this little gap that you be aggressive, that you do not wait for the guidance, because once the guidance is given, it's written, it's expressed, right? And that says that someone is eventually going to hold you accountable to that guidance. So what you can do is being proactive here is the win of the day. Take into account that the hardest things to do you need to do first, and that likely that the hardest things to do will not even be allowed on the POAM, and get those done. And the things that will be allowed on the POAM will have a maximum of 180 days anyway. So most organizations of any size or capacity at all will probably take 3 to 6 months at the minimum to get these hard things done. So that's why you need to start now, because once you get to the 180-day max, the federal government is going to expect you to have completed all those items and updated your SPRS score to 110. To Stuart's point, please remember that when the FCA, False Claims Act, is going to come into a real hardcore reality. Now, I don't want to scare anybody, because that's not the intent. The intent is to fulfill the national security objective. But eventually, someone is going to, outside of the recent examples, someone is going to take that hit, and it should not be you. So please be very careful. Make sure your SPR score is accurate, and making sure that it's reliable and that you have the evidence to support these requirements. And do not assume that you understand the requirements, and do not assume that you've met them just because your IT person says you have. Okay, you need to make sure that your IT folks, as hardworking as they are, have a very solid understanding of these requirements, because most don't. Most, in my experience. All right.
Anything to add, Stuart, and let that be the last word today?
I think just in terms of requirements, which ones will be allowed POAMs, a guideline is, if you look at the scoring system for SPRS, there are some controls that are worth a point, some that are worth 3 points, some that are worth 5 points. The 5-point controls probably will not be POAMable, if that's a word, and it's likely those that are 1 point are the ones that you'll be given some time on. But as Regan said, the hardest ones are the ones that take the most time. Those are the ones more likely, or most likely, to be on a POAM and need to be addressed.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate your insights as always. And I think we'll turn it back over to Orly.
All right. Thank you, everyone in the audience who's still here. My gosh, we're over an hour into this thing, and overtime by about 5 minutes, and people are still hanging on to our every word. So we must have done something right. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Regan. Thank you, Greg. Audience, thanks for your great questions. And you will all get a recording, an email sent to you with a link to the recording of today's webinar, along with the slides. And if you have any further questions, you know how to reach us. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Very good. Thank you, Orly.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.